at our passage for today, which is from the book of Acts, chapter 16. And there Luke writes that during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And from Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day, we went on to Neapolis. And from there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed there several days. And on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. And one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. The year was 1669, and that particular year, a most unusual occurrence took place. The entire village of Brunswick, England, just simply slipped into the sea. Bad stuff happens, huh? Sounds like a bumper sticker. But here's what's interesting, folks. Not a single inhabitant of Brunswick drowned that day. And why? Well, it seems that the residents of that village just happened to be all attending a funeral in a nearby town at the exact time of that catastrophe. That's some pretty strange stuff, isn't it? Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Now, if you had been a resident of Brunswick, where not a single life was lost in that terrible tragedy because you all just happened to be at a funeral in another town, would you have just sort of chalked that up to an amazing coincidence? Or would you have tended to see it as providence? In other words, was it the hand of God or just mere happenstance? Sort of like Humphrey Bogart said to Ingrid Bergman in the film Casablanca, "Out of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she just happened to walk into mine." Was it mere chance? Was it destiny? There sure are a lot of films that kind of deal with this whole subject. Films like romantic comedy Serendipity, you might remember that film, starring John Cusack and Kate Beckinsale, who during the Christmas season, they both grabbed the same pair of black cashmere gloves there in the Bloomingdale's department store in New York City. They have this amazing day together, but they never learn each other's names, and then fate sort of separates them. And the movie and the years go on, and they each go through this series of relationships, always seemingly pining after this supposed soulmate that they spent that one chance encounter with all those years ago. So the movie wrestles with the question of whether some things are just meant to be. Sort of like Bill Murray sang in the Ghostbusters, "Call it fate, call it luck, call it karma." Does everything in life really happen for a reason? According to the makers of Serendipity, it does, because a series of unbelievable, serendipitous, coincidental things all coincide to bring these two souls back together by the end of the movie. As writer Emery Allen hypothesizes, do you think that the universe fights for some souls to be together? Well, some things are just too strange and too strong to just be coincidental, he says. So let me ask you, what do you think about this theory? Is it the universe, fate, karma, destiny, kismet? Is it coincidence or chance, or is it God? It's an age-old conundrum Do we have free will, our own ability to choose for ourselves, or is everything according to our theologically reformed Dutch ancestors in these here parts? All predestined, foreordained. Let's take a book that was written by a guy by the name of Squire Rushnell called When God Winks at You, How God Speaks Directly to You Through the Power of Coincidence. I suppose it's not coincidental that the women's retreat talked about this book yesterday, unbeknownst to me. It's just a coincidence, right? So Rushnell says, every time you experience what some call a coincidence, could it be a direct and personal message of reassurance from God? What I like to call, he says, a God wink. Remember when you were young, he says, and maybe a bit anxious, and you'd look up to see someone you loved looking back, and just to let you know silently that everything was going to be all right, they gave you a little wink. Well, could it be that every so-called coincidence just might be God's way of giving you his small, silent communication, a little wink? Hey, it's going to be all right. Let's take the first story that Rushnell tells in his book. It's about a woman who 20 years ago in Anaheim, California, Mavis Jackson, she drives by the Crystal Cathedral every day and she says to herself, someday I'm going to go there. And one Sunday, she decides to go. Out of the blue, she goes. She takes her seat. She watches the big 3,000-seat megachurch auditorium fill up. She's awed by the voices of the powerful choir. She marvels at the beauty of the sanctuary. And at the end of the service, she gets up and just to sort of make some small talk with the young woman beside her, she says, I'm so glad I came. Wasn't it just wonderful? And the woman nods. And she says, are you from around here? And the woman says, no, I'm from the Midwest. Adding, I'm actually here on sort of a personal mission. I'm looking for my birth mother. And there was a pause. I know how you must feel, said Mavis. A long time ago, I had to give up my baby girl for adoption. I didn't want to, but and there was another pause. When was her birthday? Asked the young woman. October 30th, said Mavis. And there was a gasp. That's my birthday, exclaimed the woman. A remarkable coincidence, a God wink, reunited a long-lost mother and her daughter. And what are the odds of that? I mean, it seems for years that young Cheryl Wallace, she had been haunted by not knowing who her birth mother was and why she had given young Cheryl up. And there in her small Midwestern town, 1,000 or more miles away, everybody always discouraged her from looking and said, oh, it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. But then a hint came, and there was a word that maybe her birth mother had moved out to Orange County, California. And while they're looking for that needle in that haystack, Cheryl decided to enlist God's help by going to the Crystal Cathedral. So let's ask the question again. Was it just a coincidence or was it providence? Did God lead both Mavis and Cheryl to the same place at the same time, or was it just circumstantial? I guess it all depends on what you believe about the universe, or more specifically about God. And as we'll discover in today's lesson from Acts 16, it seems that the Apostle Paul had more than his fair share of serendipitous moments that brought him into contact with a wide assortment of people. He traveled all over the rim of the Mediterranean Sea, sometimes not knowing exactly where he was going or who or why he was supposed to meet, who he met, or what kind of reception he would get once he got there. Nevertheless, the Lord prompted him to go, and he went because he trusted God to show him what to do. And such is the case we discover in today's lesson. One night, we read Paul has this vision of a man from Macedonia standing there, and he's begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. One could wonder from such an experience whether Paul might start checking his drinking cup for signs of tampering. And yet Paul chose to believe that this was a call from God. And so he and three of his comrades, they embark at once for Macedonia. It was a hard journey. They traveled by boat. They were forced, as we heard, to make numerous stops along the way, including at Philippi, the leading city of the district of Macedonia. Evidently, there was no synagogue for the Jews in Philippi. So when the Sabbath came, as we heard sung in that old movie, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" They all went down to the river to pray, studying about that good old way of who shall wear the golden crown. Good Lord, show me the way. Oh brother, let's go down to the river to pray. Oh, sister, let's go down to the river to pray. So they all went down to the river to find a place to pray, because it seems like the river was a favorite place for pious folk to go on the Sabbath. It just so happened that particular day there was a group of women down by that river who had come to pray. So Paul and his companions who went down there too began to talk with them. And one of the women, her name we heard was Lydia. So I want you to visualize Lydia as a sort of successful businesswoman, slender, smartly dressed, carrying her attaché case with her smartphone, which she consulted quite frequently. Yeah, I think Lydia would have been quite comfortable in this day and age. Lydia was a successful dealer in a ware that was called purple cloth. She was probably very wealthy. You see, purple was the color of the Roman elite. Indeed, the emperor and only the emperor would wear a toga that was made entirely out of purple cloth. Purple dye, it was quite expensive. It was made from the juice that was extracted in minute quantities from a particular kind of shellfish. It took literally thousands of those little crustaceans to make just 1 yard of purple cloth. So purple fabric was worth its weight literally in silver. So franchises for dealing in purple weren't exactly as common as procuring a license to open a Taco Bell. Such a franchise was rare. It was highly coveted. And friends, that Lydia was a woman of considerable means, I think, is also evidenced by the size of her household, because at the conclusion of today's little short vignette that we heard, she invites Paul and those who are with him to stay at her home. And what makes this impressive is the fact that Lydia didn't live alone. There were others who lived in her household, probably servants as well as children. No husband is mentioned. She might have been a widow, who knows? But anyway, to house 4 itinerant evangelists, in addition to the rest of her household, it indicates that Lydia's house was quite large for the time. And I think it's also important to note here that Lydia was not a Jew, and yet she did worship God. In fact, as Lydia listened to Paul's message, Luke even tells us that the Lord opened her heart, and as a result, right there on the spot, she and her whole household were baptized into the Christian faith down by that river. And afterwards, she invited Paul and his companions back to her home. Incidentally, Lydia would end up being Paul's first convert in Europe. It's a touching story, But if we were to ask Lydia, hey, did you sort of happen to be there when Paul came down to that river to pray? If we asked her, how do you think things worked out? I mean, was it just sort of providence or coincidence? How would she have answered? Obviously, we could make a case either way. And yet, you know what? I believe that Lydia would say that her encounter with Paul was providence. Because Lydia was a person of faith even before she was exposed to the gospel. And dear ones, this is important. Why? Because there's a tendency on the part of some religious folk to sort of divide the world into the saved and the unsaved, the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, it's all black and white. It's plain and simple. If you're not a baptized believer in these people's eyes, then you are somehow inferior, unacceptable, probably immoral too. And yet, interestingly enough, folks, the New Testament, it isn't that narrow. In the New Testament, there are Jews and there are Christians, and then there are people who are referred to as God-fearers. And friends, Lydia fits the description of a God-fearer. In fact, Luke refers to Lydia simply as a worshiper of God, which means in today's church language that we might refer to her as a seeker, someone who's outside of the traditional faith community but is seeking God. You know, there's a man in Acts chapter 10 who also fits the description of a God-fearer. His name was Cornelius. And Cornelius was an officer in what was known as the Italian regiment of the Roman army. Cornelius commanded 100 men whose main job was to maintain order in a town called Caesarea. He also was not a Jew. Neither was he a Christian. But I want you to listen to how Luke describes him. He and his whole family were devout, and they were God-fearing. And he gave generously to those in need, and he prayed to God regularly. You get the sense of what God's word is trying to communicate to us here this morning? Can there be someone who's outside of the mainstream of the Judeo-Christian faith who's still devout and still seeking and God-fearing? In fact, according to the book of Acts here, can there be those outside of the mainstream of the community of faith who are used by God? The Old Testament has all kinds of stories of those who God used for his sovereign and providential purposes. Remember the name of a man by the name of Naaman, the commander of the army of Aram, who goes to Elijah for healing of his leprosy in 2 Kings. Or how about Ruth, the Moabitess, who would go on to become the great-grandmother of King David? Or how about Rahab, the harlot, who God used to protect the Israelite spies who had been sent into Jericho to spy out the land? Remember how she would also go on to become a part of David's ancestry by becoming the mother of Boaz, Ruth's husband. And then who could forget King Artaxerxes of Babylon, who God used to send Nehemiah and a group of Israelites back to the homeland, back to Israel after 70 years of exile. Or King Nebuchadnezzar, there in the book of Daniel, who upon seeing Daniel's three friends, remember them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come out unscathed from this fiery furnace, and yet there's this fourth angelic being walking around inside the infernal with them. And so Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree because of what he's seen. And he says, therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. And folks, the list goes on and on of those who don't fit into our nice and neat little boxes that we want to put God into. In fact, in the story of Balaam, a pagan prophet from the book of Numbers, not only does God use this mixed up prophet, but he even uses his donkey to set the guy straight. And such is the case with our friend Cornelius in the New Testament. Because it seems that one afternoon at about 3 o'clock that Cornelius has a vision in which he sees an angel of God who comes to him and says, Cornelius. And so a bit timidly, Cornelius says, yes, what is it, Lord? And the angel says, your prayers and your gifts to the poor have caught God's attention. He has a job for you. You are to send some of your men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who's also called Peter. When the angel had gone, Cornelius calls 2 of his servants and another devout soldier, and he sends them to Joppa. Now here's what's interesting, folks. All of this was happening just by coincidence at the same time that Peter has his famous dream there in Acts chapter 10. This 4-cornered sheet being lowered from heaven, the sheet with all of those animals in it. And remember that Peter had been taught to consider some animals unclean, and yet God told Peter in that dream that nothing that he had created in and of itself was unclean. And it would be that dream that would cause Peter to finally understand that it was all right to break bread with Gentiles. And just then, coincidentally, Cornelius' Gentile men come knocking at Peter's door. Was that a God wink? A matter of providence, not mere coincidence? Well, it certainly played a pivotal role in the formation of the early church, and all because God chose to work through a non-Jewish and yet not yet Christian man named Cornelius. Yeah, Cornelius was a God-fearer, and so was Lydia. As a Gentile, she was seeking after God. So it was no accident that she just happened to be down by that river praying when she encountered Paul. Lydia was hungry after God. And folks, I've sort of belabored this point this morning for a reason. You see, our land is filled with folks like Lydia and Cornelius, good, decent people seeking after God. Perhaps they've had little or no church background. Maybe they've been turned off or hurt by the church, and yet they still hunger after God. Perhaps they hunger for God because they've seen the moral bankruptcy, the hedonism, and the materialism of our day. They want values, solid, life-changing values. They want something that can help them as they make their way through life. And we as followers of Jesus Christ need to reach out to them. We need to encounter them where they are and share genuinely and generously as to what God has done in our lives. I love the story that Dr. Eleanor Kubler-Ross tells about a woman she encountered when she was writing her famous book about death and dying. And part of Kubler-Ross's research involved interviewing dying patients in hospitals, and as she went from room to room, she noticed this remarkable pattern that sometimes she'd go into a dying patient's room and the patient would be calm, at peace, tranquil. But she also began to notice that often this was after the patient's room had been cleaned by a certain hospital orderly. So one day she's in the hospital, she happens to run across this orderly, and so she says, "What are you doing with my patients?" And the orderly, thinking that she's being reprimanded, says, "I'm not doing anything with your patients." And Kubler-Ross says, No. It's a good thing. I've just noticed that after you go into their rooms that the patients seem at peace. So I was just wondering, what are you doing with my patients? I just talked to them, said the orderly. You see, I had 2 babies of my own die, and yet God never abandoned me. So I tell them they aren't alone. I tell them that God is with them, that they don't have to be afraid. Now let's imagine that you're a patient in a hospital and you've reached the low point in your life, and then this gentle and caring woman, she shows up. While she cleans your room, she listens to your concerns, and then she shares with you how she was once in such a situation, and that she reached out to God, and that God was there for her and helped her through this bad time. And as a result, you were helped by this genuine act of caring. In fact, you come out of that hospital a stronger person. It changes how you see life. And later you look back on that experience, and how do you explain it? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it providence that you encountered that angelic woman in your hour of need? You see, folks, this is how the Apostle Paul saw his life. He had a lot of adventures. Some of them weren't very pleasant, and yet he knew that wherever he was, that there God could use him. So even though there was no synagogue, there was no crystal cathedral in Philippi to worship at, nevertheless, he and his buddies were open to the place that God led them to. And when they encountered Lydia and her friends down by that river, they realized that it was a God-ordained moment, that these women were seeking after God. Yeah. They had been brought to this place so that they could share the good news. And because they were sensitive to the whisper of God's Spirit, the smart and successful businesswoman named Lydia responded to their message. She and her whole household were baptized, and they became followers of Jesus. And you know, if you had later heard Lydia tell her story, my guess is that she would have said, you know, I was so fortunate because one day while my friends and I were praying, God sent us a messenger, a man named Paul, and it changed our lives. Friends, the Lydias of this world are all around us, and they are waiting for you and me to reach out with the love of Jesus. Yeah, we can be a tool of God's providence and grace if we will but yield ourselves to be used of God, if we will but look at every conversation and encounter as a God-sent opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. And who knows, perhaps it'll only be then that we'll come to realize that there are actually very few real coincidences in this life. As Albert Einstein once said, coincidences are just God's way of remaining anonymous. Could it be that many of these so-called coincidences are God winks, just acts of providence in disguise? What do you think? Let's pray. Father, how we desire, or maybe we don't desire, but put in us a desire to be used by you, to be open to the daily God winks that you bring our way, that if we were receptive to them, if every morning we prayed, God, show me how you can use me today, that you would open up the windows of heaven and provide so many so-called coincidences that we could not begin to believe it. Use us for those all around us who are seeking. Use us as your tool of providence and grace.